escape in history. Behind the Iron Curtain of the Cold War, one man's ideological awakening shifted the balance of global power. This is the breathtaking true story of Oleg Gordievsky, a top-tier KGB officer who risked everything to become Britain's most valuable double agent. Through a high-stakes game of deception, betrayal, and a heart-stopping escape, his journey reveals the profound human cost of living a double life. Uncover the secrets of a man who changed history from the shadows. Point 1. A seed of doubt in the Soviet machine. Stepping into the secretive world of the Soviet intelligence apparatus was supposed to be a point of immense pride for a young man raised entirely within the system. Yet, beneath the polished surface of patriotic duty, quiet fractures were beginning to form in his worldview, threatening to shatter everything he had ever known. To understand Oleg Gordievsky, you first have to understand the world that built him. He was born into the very heart of the Soviet establishment, a child of the KGB. His father was an officer who wore the uniform with unquestioning loyalty, a man who had survived the brutal purges of the Stalin era by keeping his head down and doing exactly what the state demanded. For a boy growing up in this environment, joining the intelligence service was not merely a career choice, it was an inheritance. Oleg was an exceptionally bright young man, gifted with a razor-sharp memory and a profound aptitude for languages. He was groomed for success, attending the most prestigious institutes in Moscow, where he was trained to be the perfect Soviet representative abroad. He learned how to spot weaknesses, how to manipulate targets, and how to project the absolute superiority of the communist system. At a glance, he was the ideal KGB recruit, destined to rise through the ranks and serve the motherland without a shadow of a doubt. However, human beings are rarely as simple as the ideologies that try to mold them. Oleg was not just a bureaucratic cog in a vast machine. He was a deeply intellectual soul with a profound love for classical music, literature, and history. As part of his elite training, he was granted access to materials that ordinary Soviet citizens were strictly forbidden from seeing. He read Western newspapers, listened to foreign broadcasts, and studied the cultures of the nations he was meant to infiltrate. This exposure was intended to make him a more effective spy, but instead it planted the first seeds of cognitive dissonance. He began to notice the glaring contradictions between the propaganda he was fed and the reality of the world beyond the borders. While the state-controlled media boasted of unparalleled agricultural triumphs and economic supremacy, Oleg saw the endless breadlines, the stifling censorship, and the pervasive fear that dictated everyday life in Moscow. The true breaking point, the moment that forever altered the trajectory of his life, occurred in August 1968. Oleg was a young officer assigned to a post in Western Europe when the Prague Spring blossomed in Czechoslovakia. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that a socialist country might genuinely reform itself, embracing freedom of speech, artistic expression, and democratic principles. Oleg watched this political awakening with a sense of quiet hope, but that hope was violently extinguished when Soviet tanks rolled into the streets of Prague, crushing the peaceful rebellion under the weight of sheer military brutality. The images of unarmed civilians standing in front of armored vehicles struck something deep within his core. This was not the noble defense of an ideology, it was the ruthless preservation of a totalitarian empire. The emotional devastation he experienced was profound. He felt a sickening sense of complicity. By serving the KGB, he was actively upholding a system that relied on terror and oppression to survive. The man who looked back at him in the mirror was no longer a proud patriot, but a silent prisoner of his own conscience. It is a terrifying realization to understand that your entire life, your family's legacy, and your professional identity are built on a foundation of lies. But rather than breaking under the weight of this despair, Oleg experienced a quiet, internal revolution. He did not immediately defect or throw away his career in a dramatic gesture. Instead, he made a far more dangerous choice. He decided to stay inside the machine, to wear the mask of the loyal officer, and to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. This period of his life is a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. Every day he walked into the KGB headquarters, attended meetings, wrote reports, and saluted his superiors, all while harboring a burning desire to destroy the very organization he served. He had to monitor his every facial expression, control the tone of his voice, and ensure that not a single word of his true feelings slipped out, even to his closest friends or his family. The sheer mental endurance required to live such a profound lie is staggering. He was a man awake in a nation of sleepwalkers, carrying a burden of truth that could get him executed at a moment's notice. The Soviet state had spent years meticulously training him to be a master of deception, completely unaware that he was about to turn those very skills against them in a betrayal that would eventually rock the foundations of the Cold War. Point 2. The Danish Awakening and a Secret Pact. Finding oneself in a vibrant, free society after a lifetime of gray authoritarianism can be a profoundly disorienting and exhilarating experience. For our protagonist, the colorful streets of Copenhagen became the ultimate catalyst for the most dangerous and consequential decision of his life. When Oleg Gordievsky was posted to the Soviet embassy in Denmark, the stark contrast between East and West was no longer an abstract concept read about in classified reports. It was a daily, lived reality. Copenhagen in the early 1970s was a city of bicycles, bustling cafes, open debates, and overflowing supermarkets. For a man accustomed to the drab, suspicious, and heavily monitored atmosphere of Moscow, this new environment was nothing short of intoxicating. He could walk into a bookstore and purchase literature that would earn him a prison sentence back home. He could listen to people openly criticize their government without fear of a midnight knock on the door. He absorbed the freedom of the Danish capital like a man who had been dying of thirst. The more he immersed himself in this open society, the more intolerable the idea of returning to the suffocating grip of the Soviet Union became. It was during this time that British intelligence, specifically MI6, began to take a keen interest in the young, cultured KGB officer. Intelligence work is often less about dramatic car chases and more about the slow, patient observation of human behavior. The British officers stationed in Copenhagen recognized something different about Oleg. Unlike his colleagues, who often stuck together in insular, paranoid groups, Oleg genuinely enjoyed engaging with Western culture. He attended classical music concerts, visited art galleries, and displayed an open-mindedness that was highly unusual for a Soviet operative. MI6 assigned an officer named Richard Bromhead to gently probe this potential vulnerability. Bromhead was a master of the soft approach, understanding that a man like Oleg could never be bought or coerced. He had to be understood. The recruitment dance was a masterpiece of subtlety. It began with chance encounters that were anything but accidental. A friendly nod at a diplomatic reception, a shared conversation about a piece of classical music, a casual invitation to play a game of badminton. These seemingly innocent interactions were actually high-stakes psychological assessments. During these badminton matches, between the sharp thwacks of the shuttlecock, an unspoken understanding began to form. Bromhead offered no bribes and made no threats. Instead, he offered Oleg something far more valuable, a sympathetic ear and an intellectual equal who understood the agonizing moral conflict tearing at the Russian soul. Oleg began to drop subtle hints, small breadcrumbs of information that signaled his willingness to cross the ultimate line. The defining moment occurred in a quiet, unassuming safe house in Copenhagen. When Oleg finally sat down for a formal meeting with MI6, he made his motivations crystal clear. He categorically refused to accept a single penny for his services. This is a crucial detail that sets his story apart from countless other espionage tales. Most spies betray their countries to pay off gambling debts, fund lavish lifestyles, or satisfy a bruised ego. Oleg was driven purely by ideology and conscience. He viewed the Soviet system as a cancerous tumor on the world, and he saw himself as a surgeon willing to use his insider knowledge as a scalpel. He pledged his loyalty to British intelligence, agreeing to provide them with the inner workings of the KGB. In that quiet room, a secret pact was forged that would alter the geopolitical landscape. The immediate aftermath of this decision thrust Oleg into a life of unimaginable tension. He was now a double agent, arguably the most dangerous profession on Earth. The tradecraft involved in his new life was complex and nerve-wracking. He had to master the art of the dead drop, leaving microfilms of highly classified documents in hollowed-out bricks or under park benches. He had to execute brush passes, seamlessly handing over materials to MI6 handlers while walking down crowded streets, making sure not to break stride or draw the attention of the omnipresent KGB surveillance teams. Every action required perfect timing and absolute emotional control. But the physical danger was only half the battle. The psychological burden was infinitely heavier. When his workday ended, he had to return home to his Soviet wife, a woman who believed completely in the state and had no idea that the man she married was actively working to dismantle it. He had to smile, eat dinner, and make small talk, all while carrying secrets that could result in his immediate execution. The isolation was profound. He belonged entirely to neither world. He was a traitor to his homeland, yet he could never openly embrace the West he was fighting to protect. He lived in the shadows, fueled by a solitary conviction that what he was doing, no matter how deceitful, was ultimately right. Each time he handed over a piece of KGB intelligence, he struck a blow for freedom. But with every blow, the risk of a fatal mistake grew exponentially. Point 3. Rising through the ranks in London. Ascending the career ladder is challenging enough in any profession, but doing so while secretly working for the opposition requires a level of nerve that borders on the superhuman. As the political climate grew colder and the paranoia of the Cold War deepened, the stakes in the British capital soared to unprecedented heights. Following his successful stint in Denmark and a tense period back in Moscow, Oleg Gordievsky was assigned to the Soviet embassy in London. This was one of the most prestigious and strategically vital postings in the entire KGB network. For MI6, having their prized double agent stationed right in their own backyard was an absolute dream scenario. However, Oleg was not yet the man in charge. He was a mid-level officer with ambitious superiors standing in his way. To maximize his value, British intelligence embarked on an audacious and highly unorthodox strategy. They decided to actively manage his career from the shadows. Whenever a KGB officer positioned above Oleg in the London residency proved troublesome, the British government would quietly declare them persona non grata and expel them from the country on espionage charges. To the outside world, it looked like standard diplomatic tit for tat. In reality, MI6 was systematically clearing the path for their own man. Eventually, the strategy worked flawlessly. Oleg was promoted to the position of KGB resident, the station chief in London. He was now the top Soviet intelligence officer in the United Kingdom, with unrestricted access to the Kremlin's most closely guarded secrets, strategies, and deeply held fears. The volume and quality of the intelligence he began funneling to his MI6 handlers were nothing short of spectacular. He provided the identities of Soviet spies operating in the West, detailed the KGB's negotiation tactics, and exposed the massive scale of Soviet active measures designed to manipulate Western public opinion. But Oleg's greatest contribution, the one that arguably saved the world from nuclear annihilation, occurred during the terrifying climax of 1983. The geopolitical atmosphere was toxic. The Soviet leadership, aging and deeply paranoid, had convinced themselves that the West was actively planning a preemptive nuclear strike. This fear was crystallized in a massive intelligence-gathering operation known as Operation Ryan. The Kremlin ordered officers like Oleg to look for any signs of an impending attack, asking them to monitor blood banks, track the movements of political leaders, and even count the number of lights on in government buildings at night. The situation reached a fever pitch during a NATO military exercise called Able Archer. The Soviets misinterpreted this routine war game as the real thing, genuinely believing the missiles were about to fly. They placed their own nuclear forces on maximum alert. The world was standing on the absolute brink of World War III, and the terrifying part was that the West had no idea how panicked the Kremlin truly was. It was Oleg who sounded the alarm. Through urgent, high-stakes meetings with his handlers, he conveyed the sheer depth of Soviet paranoia. He explained that the Kremlin wasn't bluffing. They were terrified, interpreting every Western move as an act of aggression. Armed with this unparalleled insight, British and American leaders abruptly changed their posture. They toned down the aggressive rhetoric, altered the parameters of the military exercises, and sent quiet, diplomatic signals to reassure Moscow that no attack was imminent. Without Oleg's intelligence, a simple misunderstanding could easily have triggered a global nuclear holocaust. This value soon reached the highest echelons of global power. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and U.S. President Ronald Reagan were regularly briefed on the intelligence provided by the man known only by his codenamed alias. When a new, reform-minded Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev visited London before taking full power, the situation became almost surreal. Oleg was responsible for briefing Gorbachev on how to deal with Thatcher, providing him with psychological profiles and suggested talking points. Simultaneously, he was secretly feeding the exact same information to MI6, allowing Thatcher to prepare the perfect counter-arguments. Through his invisible influence, Oleg essentially stage-managed one of the most important diplomatic meetings of the 20th century. When Thatcher famously declared of Gorbachev, "We can do business together," it was largely because Oleg had orchestrated a dynamic that allowed them to connect. Yet, as his influence peaked, the personal toll on Oleg became almost unbearable. He had divorced his first wife and married a woman named Leela, with whom he had 2 young daughters. Just like his previous marriage, Leela had absolutely no idea about his double life. He was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, single-handedly shaping the policies of superpowers. But he couldn't share a word of his triumphs with the people he loved most. The stress manifested in sleepless nights, a constant churning in his stomach, and the ever-present specter of the KGB counterintelligence apparatus. He was a master juggler, keeping a dozen flaming torches in the air, but he knew with terrifying certainty that he only had to drop one to burn his entire life to the ground. Point 4. The deadly shadow of Aldrich Ames. Just as the intricate web of espionage seemed perfectly balanced, a threat emerged not from the watchful eyes of Moscow, but from the very allies trusted to keep the secret. Greed, unlike ideology, knows no loyalty, and it was about to unravel years of meticulous, life-saving work. While Oleg Gordievsky was risking his life daily for the cause of Western democracy, a very different kind of intelligence officer was walking the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia. His name was Aldrich Ames. If Oleg represented the ideological highs of espionage, Ames represented its most pathetic and mercenary lows. Ames was a deeply disgruntled CIA counterintelligence officer. He was a heavy drinker, a mediocre employee who had been passed over for promotions, and a man drowning in massive personal debt, largely due to a messy divorce and the extravagant spending habits of his new wife. Ames felt underappreciated and underpaid by the country he served. Looking for a quick solution to his financial woes, he made a decision that would stain the history of American intelligence forever. Ames decided to sell out his country for cold, hard cash. In a move of breathtaking brazenness, he simply walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to reveal the identities of every Western spy operating within the Soviet Union in exchange for millions of dollars. Because of his position in counterintelligence, Ames had access to the most highly classified files the CIA possessed. Now, the CIA did not know Oleg Gordievsky's true identity. MI6 had wisely kept their prize source strictly compartmentalized to protect him. However, they had shared heavily sanitized reports with the Americans, intelligence that was so high level and specific that it could only have come from a very small handful of people within the KGB hierarchy. When Ames handed over shopping bags full of classified documents to his Soviet handlers, he gave the KGB counterintelligence division exactly what they needed to start hunting. The KGB realized with absolute horror that there was a massive leak at the very top of their organization. The intelligence provided by Ames pointed directly toward the London residency. The net began to tighten, and the atmosphere around Oleg shifted with terrifying subtlety. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. A colleague offering a lingering, unreadable glance in the hallway, a sudden delay in the official confirmation of his promotion to the rank of general. Routine communications from Moscow taking on a slightly formal, colder tone. To an ordinary person, these details would mean nothing, but to a master spy whose survival depended on reading the room, they were screaming sirens. Oleg's finely tuned intuition told him that something was terribly wrong. His handlers at MI6 also sensed the shift and offered him the option to defect immediately, to walk out of the embassy and disappear into a comfortable, protected life in the British countryside. But Oleg made a fateful, agonizing decision. He chose to return to Moscow. The KGB had summoned him back under the pretense of finalizing his formal promotion to resident. They claimed it was a routine administrative requirement. Oleg knew it might be a trap, but he also knew that if he defected now, he would lose his access, his career, and his ability to continue the fight he had dedicated his life to. He convinced himself that perhaps he wasn't fully blown, that perhaps he could talk his way out of whatever suspicions they harbored. Furthermore, his family was waiting for him. The thought of abandoning his wife and young daughters without a word was a burden he simply could not bear. The flight to Moscow was an exercise in pure psychological torture. Sitting in the pressurized cabin, staring out at the clouds, Oleg constantly replayed every conversation, every dead drop, every secret meeting. Had he left a fingerprint? Had someone seen him? The closer the plane got to Soviet airspace, the heavier the dread became. He was willingly flying back into the heart of the empire he had spent a decade betraying. He was a man stepping into a dark room, knowing full well that a loaded gun might be pointed directly at his chest. Point 5. Summoned to Moscow and the interrogation. Walking willingly into the lion's den goes against every human survival instinct, yet sometimes the illusion of safety demands taking the ultimate risk. Upon touching down on Russian soil, the chilling reality of a compromised identity began to set in with terrifying clarity. From the moment Oleg arrived in Moscow, his worst fears were confirmed. The grand welcome he might have expected as the successful London resident was entirely absent. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of unspoken suspicion. When he finally returned to his family apartment, the signs of KGB intrusion were unmistakable. The locks on the door felt slightly different, a telltale sign they had been thoroughly picked and replaced. Inside, the subtle arrangement of his personal belongings, the specific angle of a book on a shelf, the placement of papers in a drawer, had been disturbed. To a trained intelligence officer, these were not accidents. They were deliberate messages. The KGB was letting him know they were watching. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly. A few days after his arrival, Oleg was invited to a KGB compound outside of Moscow, supposedly for a friendly weekend retreat with a senior officer. The setting was a classic Russian dacha, surrounded by birch trees and quiet isolation. The atmosphere was superficially jovial, involving heavy drinking and casual conversation. But Oleg knew exactly what this was. He carefully guarded his words, drinking only moderately and maintaining his facade of a loyal, hard-working officer. Then came the turning point. He was offered a cup of tea. It was a simple, everyday gesture, but almost immediately after drinking it, the world began to blur. Oleg realized with a spike of sheer terror that the tea had been heavily laced with a powerful cocktail of psychotropic drugs and truth serums. The KGB did not have hard evidence against him yet. Ames's information was circumstantial enough that they needed a confession. As the drugs took hold, stripping away his inhibitions and clouding his cognitive functions, the friendly facade of the retreat vanished. Two aggressive counterintelligence interrogators entered the room, and the friendly chat turned into a brutal, relentless grilling. They hammered him with questions about his time in London, his contacts with the British, and the leaked information. Who are you working for? Tell us about British intelligence. Confess, and things will go easier for you. The physical and mental strain placed on Oleg in that room is almost unimaginable. He was fighting a chemical battle within his own brain, struggling to keep his deeply buried secrets from bubbling to the surface. It was the ultimate test of his years of compartmentalization. Miraculously relying on sheer willpower and a deeply ingrained instinct for survival, he managed to deflect their accusations. Even under the influence of the drugs, he stuck to his cover story, feigning indignation and confusion at their questions. He survived the interrogation without breaking, but the victory was hollow. The KGB officers knew he was lying, even if they couldn't definitively prove it. Oleg woke up the next morning with a crushing headache and the devastating realization that his career, and likely his life, were effectively over. He was allowed to return to Moscow, but he was now a prisoner in his own city. The surveillance became incredibly overt. Teams of KGB watchers followed him everywhere he went. They stood outside his apartment building, trailed him on the subway, and monitored every phone call. The message was clear. We know what you are, and we are just waiting for the final proof to execute you. The psychological toll of this period was agonizing. He had to continue living with his wife and daughters, pretending that everything was fine, while knowing that at any moment the door could be kicked in. He watched his children play, a heartbreaking ache in his chest, knowing he might never see them grow up. He was completely cut off from his MI6 handlers, isolated in a sea of enemies. The trap had firmly closed around him. There was only one final, desperate card left to play. It was a contingency plan so risky, so fraught with potential failure, that it had only ever been discussed as an absolute last resort. It was time to initiate the escape. Point 6. The desperate signal in Operation Pimlico. When the walls of the state apparatus close in, survival relies on a meticulously planned contingency that sounds more like fiction than reality. The time had come to execute an extraction so audacious that it would forever be etched in the annals of secret intelligence. Years earlier, realizing the immense danger their star agent faced, MI6 had devised an intricate, highly dangerous exfiltration plan codenamed Operation Pimlico. It was a plan that required perfect timing, immense bravery, and no small amount of luck. To trigger the operation, Oleg had to send a specific visual signal to the British intelligence officers stationed under diplomatic cover in Moscow. The mechanics of this signal were absurdly specific, designed to blend into the mundane background of city life while being unmistakable to a trained eye. The procedure dictated that on a specific Tuesday, at exactly 7:30 p.m., Oleg had to walk down a particular stretch of Kutuzovsky Prospect. He had to be wearing a gray cap and, most importantly, carrying a plastic shopping bag from the British supermarket chain Safeway. If a British officer saw this signal, they were to acknowledge it by walking past him carrying a Harrods bag and eating a Mars bar. It sounds like the plot of a spy film, but in the grim reality of Moscow, these Western items were incredibly rare and served as the perfect covert communication tools. The first hurdle, and perhaps the most terrifying, was simply getting to the signaling site without his KGB watchers noticing his precise movements. Oleg embarked on a grueling, hours-long counter-surveillance route. He ducked in and out of department stores, rode the metro in agonizingly complex loops, and used every trick he had learned in his decades as a spy to shake the men tailing him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he finally approached the designated street corner. He pulled the crumpled Safeway bag from his pocket, holding it clearly by his side. He walked the route, scanning the faces of the pedestrians. Suddenly, there it was. A British man strolled past holding the Harrods bag, casually biting into a Mars bar. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. No words were spoken, but the message was deafening. We see you. The escape is on. The execution of Operation Pimlico was set for a few days later. Oleg had to make the agonizing decision to leave his family behind. He knew that if he tried to take them, the escape would fail and they would all be doomed. He kissed his sleeping daughters goodbye, a moment of profound heartbreak, and slipped out of his apartment for the last time. He once again utilized exhaustive counter-surveillance tactics to evade his watchers, eventually boarding a train bound for the city of Leningrad, and from there a bus heading toward the dense forest near the Finnish border. The rendezvous point was a desolate stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. Oleg waited in the damp, mosquito-infested woods, shivering in the cold, jumping at every snapped twig. If the plan failed, if the KGB had intercepted the communications, he would be standing alone in the forest waiting for an execution squad. But MI6 did not abandon their man. Two Ford sedans, driven by British diplomats and their wives, appeared down the dusty road. They had driven out from the embassy under the guise of a weekend picnic. The moment the cars stopped, the reality of the extraction set in. There were no helicopters, no armed guards, just a desperate man and a car trunk. The diplomats quickly opened the boot of one of the sedans. Oleg, a high-ranking KGB general, folded his body into the cramped, dark space, wrapping himself in an aluminum thermal blanket designed to foil the infrared heat sensors used by the Soviet border guards. The trunk slammed shut, plunging him into total darkness. As the engine roared to life and the car began speeding toward the heavily fortified border, Oleg lay in the suffocating heat, his life now entirely in the hands of the British agents driving the car. The final, most dangerous phase of Operation Pimlico had begun. Point 7. The border crossing and the price of freedom. The final stretch of any escape is often the most harrowing, where every passing second feels like an eternity and the line between salvation and doom is razor thin. Approaching the border checkpoint, the grand geopolitical chess match distilled down to a few agonizing, breathless moments. Inside the trunk of the Ford sedan, the conditions were hellish. The heat radiating from the exhaust pipe was unbearable, and the air was growing dangerously thin. Oleg Gordievsky lay curled in the fetal position, the crinkling of the thermal blanket the only sound competing with the roar of the engine and the frantic beating of his own heart. He was a man suspended between two worlds, the empire that wanted him dead and the freedom that seemed impossibly far away. As the vehicles finally approached the Soviet-Finnish border, the tension in the passenger cabin was equally palpable. The British diplomats, fully aware that they were committing a massive act of espionage that could result in their own imprisonment, gripped the steering wheels with white knuckles. The border crossing at Torfyanovka was notorious for its thoroughness. Soviet guards, armed with assault rifles and accompanied by aggressive sniffer dogs, meticulously inspected every vehicle that attempted to leave the country. When the cars pulled up to the checkpoint, the guards ordered the drivers to turn off the engines. The sudden silence was terrifying. Oleg could hear the heavy boots of the guards crunching on the gravel just inches from his head. He could hear the low, guttural growls of the KGB sniffer dogs as they circled the vehicles. If a dog caught his scent, or if a guard casually decided to pop the trunk, it would all be over. It was in this moment of absolute peril that the quick thinking of the British diplomats' wives saved the day. Realizing that the sniffer dogs were getting dangerously close to the trunk where Oleg was hidden, one of the wives pulled out a bag of potato chips. With feigned innocence, she began tossing the chips out the window onto the ground. The highly trained KGB dogs, momentarily distracted by the greasy snack, broke their focus and began eating the chips, ruining their ability to detect the human scent emanating from the boot. But the danger wasn't past. A guard approached the rear of the car, looking suspiciously at the trunk. In an act of sheer brilliant improvisation, another wife grabbed her infant baby, who was sitting in the back seat, and placed the child directly onto the trunk of the car. She then proceeded to loudly and messily change the baby's dirty diaper right there on the metal surface. The Soviet guard, disgusted by the smell and the chaotic scene of the screaming infant, quickly backed away, wanting nothing to do with the mess. He hastily stamped their passports and waved the cars through. The vehicles slowly rolled over the demarcation line, passing the final barrier. They were out of the Soviet Union. They were in Finland. Inside the trunk, Oleg had no way of knowing they had crossed the border. He was still suffocating in the dark. The diplomats could not stop the cars immediately, fearing that Soviet border snipers might still be watching. They drove for several more miles into the Finnish countryside before finally pulling over onto a quiet side road. The driver had one final predetermined signal to deliver. He inserted a cassette tape into the car's stereo and cranked the volume up to the maximum. The soaring, majestic notes of Karelia Suite by the Finnish composer Jean Sibelius blasted through the speakers, vibrating through the metal frame of the car. Hearing the music, Oleg knew what it meant. The trunk popped open, flooding the dark space with blinding daylight and the crisp, clean air of the free world. Oleg stumbled out of the car, gasping for breath, his clothes soaked in sweat. He fell into the arms of the British diplomats. Against all impossible odds, Operation Pimlico had been a success. He had pulled off the greatest espionage escape in history. He was free. Point 8. The conclusion. Escaping the clutches of a totalitarian regime is a monumental victory, but the echoes of a double life continue to resonate long after the immediate danger has passed. True freedom, it turns out, often demands a heartbreakingly high personal price. Oleg Gordievsky's arrival in the United Kingdom was treated as an intelligence triumph of the highest order. He was immediately taken to a secure, safe house where he spent months undergoing exhaustive debriefing sessions. The information he provided in those subsequent months finally allowed Western intelligence to fully map out the KGB's operations, leading to the expulsion of dozens of Soviet spies worldwide. Back in Moscow, the realization that their star London resident was a British spy sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. The highest echelons of the KGB were utterly humiliated. Careers were ruined, generals were fired, and a death sentence was handed down to Oleg in absentia, a sentence that officially has never been revoked by the Russian state. However, the euphoria of his successful escape was deeply overshadowed by a profound personal tragedy. By choosing to save his own life and continue his ideological fight, Oleg had been forced to leave his wife Lila and his two young daughters behind in Moscow. The KGB, furious and seeking revenge, immediately targeted his family. Lila was subjected to relentless interrogations, public humiliation, and constant surveillance. She was treated as an enemy of the state despite having absolutely no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities. For 6 agonizing years, Oleg waged a tireless, very public campaign from London to secure the release of his family. He leveraged his connections with Margaret Thatcher and other world leaders, forcing them to bring up the issue of his family in every diplomatic meeting with the Soviets. Finally, as the Soviet Union began to collapse in 1991, the government relented and allowed Lila and the girls to travel to the UK. But the reunion was tragically bittersweet. The years of separation, the trauma of the KGB harassment, and the shocking revelation that her entire marriage had been built on a foundation of monumental geopolitical secrets proved too much for Lila to bear. The damage was irreversible, and the marriage eventually ended in divorce. It is the ultimate tragedy of the spy. The very traits that made him a hero to the world made it impossible for him to be a husband and a father. As for the man who betrayed him, justice was eventually served, albeit slowly. Aldrich Ames continued his treasonous activities for years, resulting in the deaths of numerous other Western agents. But his sudden, inexplicable wealth, driving a Jaguar and buying a mansion on a government salary, eventually tipped off the FBI. Ames was arrested in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. a pathetic figure who sold out his colleagues for a lifestyle he could never truly enjoy. Oleg Gordievsky's legacy remains unparalleled in the history of espionage. He was not a man driven by greed, ego, or a desire for violence. He was a quiet, intellectual man who simply could not ignore the dictates of his own conscience. By choosing to stand against the brutal machinery of the state that raised him, he provided the West with the critical understanding necessary to navigate the most dangerous years of the Cold War without triggering a nuclear apocalypse. He proved that even within the darkest, most oppressive systems, the human desire for truth and freedom can still take root. He changed the course of world history from the shadows, paying a terrible personal price, but ultimately leaving the world a far safer place than he found it.